be to provide an overview of energy storage technologies, what different options, what they can do, talk a little bit about the services that they can provide, and some emerging policies with a focus on what's going on out here in the West. In a lot of ways, Western states have really led the development of energy storage policies. A lot of really innovative practices are coming out of the West. So I wanted to speak briefly about a few of the more recent developments in a few states around the West as just kind of examples of the wide range of policy options for policymakers and regulators to consider as they're looking at creating opportunities for energy storage on the grid. So next slide. And then, finally, we'll speak a little bit about the role of storage in microgrids. I'll talk about a report we did looking at some planning considerations for identifying how and where to deploy energy storage for resilience purposes. Next slide. And one more. Okay, so there's three basic types of energy storage. First, we have mechanical storage. This is where electricity is stored as potential energy that we're later using to generate electricity. So in the case of pumped storage hydro, we're storing it in water at a higher elevation that runs through a generator. In compressed energy storage, we're compressing that air and then releasing it later to drive a natural gas turbine. Then in flywheels, if there are any engineers in the room, I apologize for the simplicity, but if you remember those little cars you had when you were kids and you pull back and let them go, that's basically what a flywheel is. You wind it up one way, it stores electricity, you let it go the other way. A lot of benefits with mechanical storage. In a lot of ways, this is the most tried and proven ways we have of storing electricity. And it runs a wide spectrum. So you look at pump storage hydro, you look at compressed air energy storage. These are technologies that are capable of very large deployments as well as long duration storage. And will be on the grid for a long time, 25 years, 40 years, maybe even longer. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you have flywheels, which have very short duration, used for things like frequency response, things that don't need a very long duration. Little bit higher round trip efficiency, and slightly shorter life, but still, a good 15 to 20 years can be expected out of them. Next slide. Then we've got thermal technologies. This is where we're storing electricity as heat, or we're changing its temperature. We're using it to generate heat. We're using it to generate ice that we'll later use for energy management or electricity production. So the most common example right now, of course, is ice thermal storage, where we're using electricity to generate ice and then use that ice to pre-cool, or excuse me, to cool during peak periods. It's not a traditional energy storage technology in the form of electricity in, electricity out, but it is a storage technology in the sense of electricity in and then reduced electricity need later on. Concentrating solar, we've got really just one example of this, one utility scale example of this in the US, down in the desert outside of Las Vegas, a concentrating solar facility where basically we're using tons and tons of mirrors to reflect sunlight up to a single point. You can see that tower in the middle. There's a molten salt solution in that tower. That sunlight heats it up throughout the day, and then that heat is used to generate electricity. There's a storage component here because that latent heat can be used for several hours after the sun goes down. The plant can still continue generating. Next slide. I think did we miss the battery slide? Can we go back 2 slides? Huh. Interesting. Okay, there's a slide missing. I did have a slide talking about batteries. Just very briefly, as Commissioner Rendall mentioned in her introduction, most of what's going on right now is lithium-ion technology. Lithium-ion enjoys a lot of advantages, primarily in the form of its supply chain. There's a lot of demand for it from the electric vehicles industry, so we're seeing lots of development in supply chains and manufacturing capability. But there are some limitations with lithium-ion batteries. You're only going to get up to about 4 hours duration. The cycle life, you're going to get about 3,500 cycles out of it. So if you're thinking, daily cycles, that's about 10 years of life out of it. And there are very real challenges that we're still trying to figure out with lithium ion, safety challenges. I'm sure everyone's aware of the fires that have taken place. The recyclability challenges. DOE is actively investing in ways to manage those challenges, but they are still things that we need to figure out. A couple of other options on the electromechanical side, flow batteries, of course, which have longer durations but are a much less proven technology. This is essentially where you're storing electricity in a fluid, essentially a fluid electrolyte, and then pumping it through the system. And then there's a membrane where there's an interaction taking place to generate that electricity. The challenge that we've discovered with this is that we figured out the chemistry very well, but the act of actually pumping all this through and maintaining that system, the mechanical side of the system, has proven to be a big challenge. And so that's still an area of active development and research in the flow storage, the flow battery community. And then finally, sodium batteries. The unique thing about sodium batteries is that they have a very, very high operating temperature. Because the sodium is maintained in a molten state in order to maintain the electric generation. There's active research taking place at DOE and the national labs trying to reduce that operating temperature, trying to figure out how to make solid state sodium batteries where we don't have to maintain it in a molten state. But with all that said, here on this slide now we have the total installed capacity for energy storage in the US. And as you can see, the vast majority of what we have, almost 93%, is in the form of pumped hydro storage. Batteries have, despite their growth, still represent a relatively small amount of the overall amount of energy storage that we have on the grid. Pulling out that battery component to the right, the majority of what we do have is lithium ion. And actually lithium ion share of that battery is actually growing over time. Lead acid, you don't see a lot of lead acid deployed right now. Primarily where you see this is in critical backup. So if you've ever been inside a substation, a utility substation, you've probably seen a row of lead acid batteries just to maintain substation operations in the event of an outage. That's really one of the most common uses for the technology right now. Lead acid, it is very cheap. It's definitely the lowest cost form of energy storage, but it does have a very limited cycle life. Just a few hundred cycles. So you see it deployed in situations like that where there's a critical need for backup, but it's not being used during normal operations. Next slide, please. So there's a link to the bottom here, a link at the bottom of the page here to a report that some of my colleagues at PNNL recently did. And there's actually an updated version of that report now that I should throw into the chat later. But what they did is they just looked around to see what are all the different types of energy storage, and they tried to do an apples to apples comparison, recognizing that different technologies have different performance characteristics, different cost structures. They tried to put all that in common terms to do an apples to apples comparison of the capabilities and the costs of energy storage technologies. And so this is really just an eye chart to point out the type of work that they did. Like I said, you can read the full report down at the bottom. Next slide. So when we're talking about energy storage costs, it's really important to keep in mind that there's much more than just buying the battery. So when you see, news articles, industry articles talking about the declining cost of batteries, usually they're just talking about the battery itself. But it's important to remember that to actually install and connect a battery to the grid, there is a different additional infrastructure and additional costs that need to be added. Can we click through this to bring up the one more? Okay, yeah. So just kind of an example of a 4-hour lithium ion product. So if you look at the bottom left, that's your battery capacity, just the battery itself, and that's going to run you about $271 per kilowatt hour. But you also need to add in the power conversion on the bottom right. This is the inverter that allows the battery that converts the DC output of the battery to the AC power we use on the grid. Up in the top left, you've got the balance of plant. You've got things like, the controls, the switches, the management software. You've got, HVAC. If this is an enclosed space for a lithium ion, you have to keep that operating temperature down. So you need an HVAC component to manage your temperature. Construction and commissioning, actually, building this thing, pouring the pad, doing the construction. So the point is that, the total all-in cost for a 4-hour lithium battery down at the bottom there is about $469 per kilowatt hour. So that battery component that we see, that is the often cited cost of a battery, only represents somewhere between 40 and 50%. These costs vary significantly depending on the project and the circumstances. But that battery cost is usually going to be about 40 to 50% of the overall system cost. Next slide. So now we'll talk a little about the various services that energy storage can provide and the ways that those services can be valued. Next slide. So the unique thing about energy storage, what makes it different from anything else that really makes it a game changer for the grid, is that it can provide service across all the functions of the grid. We've never had a device or an asset that can really do anything like that. We're saving questions till the end, right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. So when we think about the grid and the different functions of the grid, energy storage can provide service at all those. When we're talking about energy storage as a generation asset, it can provide capacity, it can provide energy, and it can provide all the ancillary services. Things like frequency regulation, spin, non-spin reserves, frequency response. Moving to the transmission side, now we can use energy storage to do thermal management on the transmission system, making sure that the transmission lines are operating within their prescribed limits. We can do congestion relief. If we have a load pocket that has inadequate transmission to meet it, we can put energy storage inside that load pocket. During low demand periods, we can charge up that battery or that energy storage device. And then during high demand periods, when we don't have enough transmission to meet the load, we've already got that energy storage in the load pocket to help meet the load. So doing that, we can defer additional investments in transmission. Moving to distribution, we can do similar functions of transmission in terms of, managing power flows, deferring the need for investment. We can also do things like voltage support, conservation voltage reduction, using batteries to make sure that we're operating that the distribution system at the lowest viable voltage level. We can also use energy storage to do things like improve our DG integration, improve our hosting capacity, allow for additional distributed energy resources to be connected to the grid. And then finally, moving to the customer side of the grid, behind the meter applications, we can use energy storage for time of use rate management. We can use it for demand charge reduction. We can use it for power quality and backup power. So energy storage, unlike any other asset in the sense that we can use it at any point on the grid, at any function of the grid to provide values. Next slide. So the challenge though is that, energy storage, it can do a lot of things, but it can't do them all at once. So anytime we're picking one service, there's opportunity costs. There's things we can't do while we're providing that service. There's things we can't do while we're recharging from providing that service. So in order to really understand how and where to use a battery, you have to have a very clear understanding of what those values are. What are the values of these different services that the device could provide? This is a link to another report that some of my colleagues did a couple years ago. It was essentially a very large literature review where they just looked at all the valuation studies of energy storage that have been done to that point, just to understand not only the full range of values that it can provide, and you can see about a dozen values there across the bottom, but how do those values differ by location and by study? Those values are dictated by a number of factors, the resource mix of the local system, the infrastructure, the transmission and distribution system infrastructure, contingency conditions, what happens in that N-1 situation. Is there an opportunity for energy storage to help maintain reliable service in a contingency event? What do the utility tariffs say? And of course, the market structure. And so the point is, in order to understand what the potential value of an energy storage device, you need to have a clear understanding going into the analysis of what the services are that it can provide, what the values of those services are, so that you can know how to optimize the device to get the highest and best use out of it based on those service values. Next slide. So we're also working on a series of reports here at PNNL. We're actually finishing up the second one in that report, where we're thinking about energy storage from a slightly different paradigm, and we're calling this embedded energy storage. You know, the idea here is that we would use energy storage instead of just adding it to the grid like we have been doing to provide flexibility by doing things like providing ancillary services or deferring infrastructure, to actually put it into the system, make it an embedded part of the grid the same way that we have like a transformer or a substation, make it just a function of the grid, similar to what we have with the natural gas industry. What's unique about electricity is it's the only commodity that we have that doesn't have any kind of any kind of storage component in its supply chain. Anything else you think about, anything else you buy has some kind of storage component built into a supply chain, a warehouse, a granary, a reservoir, whatever form that may be. And that embedded storage in that supply chain creates a lot of value for customers. It resolves mismatches between supply and demand, so that keeps costs down, and it stabilizes prices and it protects customers. So the question we're wrestling with in this series is, when we built out the electric grid, we didn't have energy storage technologies that we could just put wherever we needed them. Now that we have that technology, should we think about retrofitting the grid to embed energy storage in it the same way we've done with everything else? So you can see a link to the first report where we talked about, we're kind of just what would this look like? What is this idea? There's a second report we're just finalizing probably next week that talks about some of the regulatory implications and what would it take to enable this kind of use. Next slide. So just kind of an example of what we're thinking. So this is just a very, very simple clip art illustration of the concept. So we have a city, and we assume that on average, they're consuming 1 million cubic feet of natural gas. During peak, that increases to 1.5 million cubic feet. On the electric side, they're consuming 100 megawatts on average, but during peak, that increases to 125 megawatts. And you can see that on the gas side, by having that storage facility in the delivery system, the upstream portion of the pipe, everything of the system, everything leading into that storage facility, we can size based on average demand. We only need to size it to meet that average 1 million cubic feet. And then when demand is low, we can fill up that storage facility. And when demand is high, we can use that storage facility to meet the demand. So the only part of the system that needs to be sized based on peak demand is that last mile, everything downstream of the storage facility. Obviously it'd be more than a mile, but just everything downstream of the storage facility. On the electric side, however, we don't have that flexibility. If our peak demand is 125 megawatts, we have to design and build the system to provide 125 megawatts from generation to transmission to distribution. Next slide. Oh, right, poll question. So I'm just curious to know, there's no right answer here. Just thinking about energy storage in your state, what would be the primary value? What would be what do you think would be the highest value for energy storage in your state? No love for ancillary services. Okay, interesting. All right, that's interesting. Thank you. So embedded storage, it's an interesting idea, but there are a ton of questions, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Theoretically, if we could have embedded storage in the grid, we could facilitate more efficient use of the design and use of the electric grid. We could reduce costs by managing volatility, by reducing the need for peaking resources, by potentially reducing the need hold back generation to provide ancillary services. But there are a ton of regulatory barriers to this. We don't have any kind of standard that would support this type of use of energy storage. There's nothing in a reliability standard that would support it. We don't have standards for resilience on the grid. It would be difficult to work this into planning processes. Regional transmission plans generally have a slow track record for incorporating new technologies and new ideas. There's questions of the ownership models. There's security and controls issues. If this thing is embedded in the grid, there are cybersecurity issues, there are physical security issues, and that may complicate opportunities for third-party ownership. Compensation structure, we don't have markets that could compensate this kind of service. Our markets are based on correcting deviations. We have our scheduled energy and our scheduled demand, and then as those vary, we compensate resources that could correct the variances. Things for like energy imbalance, like frequency regulation. But if we have a device in the system that's absorbing that volatility and essentially preventing it from happening, or reducing the amount that we see, markets aren't designed to compensate a counterfactual. There's no way of measuring what didn't happen. And because there's no standards, it's really tough to make the case for this as a regulated asset. And metrics, how do you measure a buffer? How do you quantify the contribution of this thing to the grid? So we're just starting to think through, how would you value this? How would you quantify those impacts? How would you compensate them? And so that's something that we're teeing up for a future paper. Next slide. So we've talked through, some of the capabilities of energy storage, some of the challenges associated with its valuation and deployment. So I wanted to talk through some of the examples we're seeing around the country, really, for energy storage policy development, but then focus in particular on the West, because as I said at the beginning, a lot of leadership is coming out of Western states on this topic. Next slide.
Hey, Jeremy, I just want to let you know you have about 10, 11 minutes left. Okay,
thank you. So what we're seeing in the last few years is that state policymaking on energy storage is really starting to accelerate and diversify. I thank you to Lisa for helping me fix this slide. Initially, I had just everything falling off the page, and that was going to help me make the point, but Lisa reconfigured it to get everything on the page so that we could see it. But, so the blue line up there is the amount of battery storage that's been deployed on the grid. And you can see how it's really started to accelerate, especially just in the last year. And at the bottom, you can see, the types of different policies that states are starting to adopt. And not only are we seeing more activity in the last few years, we're also seeing different types of activity. We're seeing states still do things like, like mandates and procurement goals, but we're starting to see states dive into some really complicated issues, things like ownership structures, things like taxation of energy storage, things like using energy storage for local resource adequacy, really getting into the nuts and bolts of what these devices can do. And there's a report at the bottom of the page there that talks about some of these different types of policies. It's a report we did to kind of quantify or describe the type of policy activity that's taken place. Next slide. So one of the things we do at PNNL is maintain this energy storage policy database. And this is where we're just trying to keep up with what states are doing around the country, and it's starting to be a very difficult job, just because, as I said, there's a lot going on. But what we're doing on this website is trying to take all this activity and just kind of describe it in 5 ways, have a taxonomy for describing what's going on. So there's 5 basic types of policy that's taking place. Procurement targets is obviously a very popular activity still. This is where the state's just saying, we want X amount of energy storage on the grid. Regulatory adaptation, this is where states are starting to think through, how do we modify or adapt our regulatory processes in order to accommodate the unique values of energy storage. Commissioner Rendall mentioned the policy statement that the UTC did a couple years ago about this, directing utilities about, or guiding utilities about how they should be including energy storage in their IRPs. Demonstration programs, this is where the state is providing funding for a demonstration program of energy storage. And usually in return, the state is gaining access to the data, the performance data of the facilities in order to help guide economic evaluation of them, and guide future policy development around based on how the devices are performing. Financial incentives, these are to end use customers, helping them to install energy storage, industrial, commercial, residential customers. It can be things like incentives, tax breaks, and then finally consumer protection. This has been done in a couple states, both in the West, Colorado and Nevada, where the legislature has actually said that customers have a right to install energy storage. And so the implications are that the utility commission, the utilities need to have accessible, transparent, and streamlined interconnection rules and reasonable requirements for customers to install that energy storage. Next slide. So diving into the West, a few examples of innovative policies that are happening out here. So Arizona is having an active discussion right now on a procurement target. So I just want to say up front, this target is not official yet. It has been received a vote of support from the commission, but it's still subject to a rulemaking. But I wanted to point to it anyway, because it really shows the level of thought and the level of preparation and implementation that goes into achieving a procurement target. Usually where we've seen these things pop up around the country, a legislature has told the commission, we want a target, you can set the target, or sometimes the legislature sets the target, but there's usually not a lot of discussion beyond what should the target be. What's really interesting about Arizona is there's been so much activity over the years to build up an infrastructure to enable this kind of thinking about a target, as well as additional discussion about what else would be needed. So, there's been commercial incentives in place for a few years there for behind the meter energy storage. The commission recently authorized APS to do a pilot incentive program for residential energy storage. And then this one's really cool. I love to nerd out about this one, the storage aggregation order from a couple months ago. To my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first vertically integrated state to direct their utility to allow third-party aggregation of energy storage. So really unique approach here to enabling behind the meter energy storage, not only be deployed, but then also to be used in a way that benefits the grid. The order, the process around the target has proposed some additional steps. There's been some discussion about, disaggregating the target, saying, a certain amount needs to be customer owned or, behind the meter. There's been a link to decarbonization, talking about how this storage should be used in a way that specifically links to decarbonization. There's been discussion of planning reforms, increasing transparency in utility planning, both in load forecasting and the resource need identification. And then procurement reforms as well, using all source RFIs to inform those planning assumptions, and then all source RFPs to procure the resources that are identified. Next slide. So Washington, some interesting legislation approved last year to include energy storage in PACE programs. These essentially allow homeowners or property owners to finance normally clean energy technology on their property tax bill. Washington's legislation last year expanded on this idea by adding a resilience component to it. So adding things like energy storage, seismic retrofits that can also be financed on that bill. And there's some links there to some reports and the bill itself. Next slide, please. California has been leading the way on the idea of using storage as a transmission asset. FERC Order 1000 encouraged, it requires utilities that own interstate connected transmission to do regional transmission planning to coordinate with their neighbors. Order 1000 also directed those regional transmission planning processes to think about non-wires alternatives, things like energy storage, like demand response. Next slide. But California was the first of those regional processes to actually think about, okay, what would this mean? How would we actually model energy storage in a transmission planning process? And so in CAISO's 2018 plan, they were actually the first region to identify energy storage as a transmission asset. And what they found was they had this situation where they had a contingency event, an N-1 event, where if one transmission line went out, the transmission line serving this small town, Dinuba, California, would be overloaded. And so initially they said, well, we'll have to reconductor the line, increase its capacity so that doesn't happen. But they came back a couple of years later and said, well, actually, we could just put a battery at the substation there. And then if we have that line outage and all that power comes over the Dynuba system, it can go into the battery and not overload the system. So in this way, energy storage was deployed as a transmission asset, as a regulated asset in the transmission system, in a way that would protect and extend the life of the existing transmission system, defer that need, actually in this case, eliminate that need to upgrade the local system. Next slide. So really quickly here at the end, wanted to talk about the role of storage in microgrids. Next slide. Thank you. So, historically, when we talk about resilience, when we think about backup power, you put a generator. If you're a hospital, if you're a homeowner, whoever you are, and you need backup power, you buy a generator. The challenges with that is, that generator provides you with energy and capacity, but you don't really have opportunities to participate in the grid. There's a couple utilities around the country that have programs, but in general, a backup generator can't provide grid services. So you, as the asset owner, the homeowner, the hospital, you absorb all those costs. You have to buy the generator, you have to buy the fuel, you have to store the fuel, you have to do the upkeep of the generator, and there's no revenue stream. You get the backup power, but that's it. Now with energy storage, we have this new model for resilience. We're evolving from this idea of mission critical resilience, to now economic resilience, where we can take that energy storage and then we can pair it with a generator, we can pair it with distributed generation, the solar or diesel generator, whatever it may be. And we can use that battery to shape the output of those resources in a way that provides benefits to the grid. So now we have increased opportunities for grid participation. We can provide capacity and energy. We can provide regulation. We can provide reserves. We can provide arbitrage. We may be able to defer a transmission or distribution upgrade. And so we can earn offsetting revenue by providing those services. And then that can help pay for the assets that we've built. And so now we're seeing resilience be a more economic play, and we're starting to see at places like schools, like commercial office buildings, hotels, because of this potential. Next slide. So just a few questions. We don't have to go through these in general, but the idea here is to just give you a few questions that you can ask of, when you're reviewing an IRP, when you're talking to utilities, when you're thinking about policy development. What are some of the questions you can ask to think through some of these issues and identify some of the options? And I think that should be it. Yeah, a few links there to additional reports, additional resources if you're interested. But other than that, I think we can move to questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Twichell. We will actually